Today we have our wonderful Darshan, David Rosenson, and we're looking forward to his comments. And before we study together, we want to thank God for the gift of Torah. And I'm going to share the screen so we can do the blessing together. I'm going to unmute everybody, so this could be a little cacophonous, but it's all in spirit of praising God, right? Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready? All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher
קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי תורה. והערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו לפי עמך בית ישראל ונהיה אנחנו צאצאינו צאצאי עמך בית ישראל ולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני
המלך תורה לעמו ישראל.
Baruch
atah Eloheinu melech haolam אשר בחרבנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Okay, that was very nice that you used your cursor to guide us.
Of course.
It reminds me of the bouncing ball.
Like
Sing along with Mitch. And I just realized I just revealed how old I am.
Right. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to, we're going to unmute everybody so that if you want to say something, you can speak up. Just please try not to interrupt somebody else while they're speaking. If it gets too rowdy, then of course we'll have to mute everybody and call them individually. So you're on, David.
Right. If it gets too rowdy, I'm going to turn this session right around. Go back. This week's parsha is Vayechi. It is a critical transition period in the history of our people. It is the end of Jacob's life, and it is the end of the first period of our history, the period where our patriarchs are actively involved in the story. It's the last parsha in Bereshit. When we pick up the story again in Shmot, hundreds of years have passed, and the children of Israel are not just the children of Jacob; they are Bnei Israel. They are a nation, and they're a nation apart within Egypt. When looking at this parsha, it's insightful to think of this as the moment of that transition, and to think about what is going through Jacob's mind as he looks at the future and looks back at his own life. Marty, can you take us to page 293?
Of course. All right, what happened here? Okay.
So while you're posting that, let me just briefly summarize what happens in the parsha. Jacob's time is ending. He senses that he is approaching his death. The fact that he's 143 years old might have something to do with it. And he has spent the last 17 years with his sons in Egypt. And as he contemplates his death, he calls Joseph and says to him, swear to me that you will not bury me in Egypt, that you will bury me with my fathers in the cave of Machpelah. And Joseph swears that he will do it. All right, I'll just give a brief summary and then we can come back to this. So,
Did that come up? Vayachi didn't come up?
It's up.
It is up.
it's
Fine,
up.
Marty.
It is up.
It's
Oh,
up.
good.
We're good.
Sorry, I'm sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
Okay, so the Vayachi is a reference to Jacob's life, to the end of his life, and when Joseph hears that Jacob is close to death, he comes to him and he brings his two Egyptian-born sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, with him. And Jacob adopts Ephraim and Manasseh as his own children. The result of which will mean that the progeny of Joseph will get a double portion of Jacob's estate, a privilege that is usually reserved to the oldest son. And he very famously blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, crossing his hands when he does so, so that Ephraim, the younger one, receives the primary blessing. A recurring theme, which we can talk about more later. He he blesses Joseph and the children with the blessings that were bestowed upon him, which is that they will grow to be a multitude, and that they will inherit the land that was promised to Abraham. And right after that, Jacob calls all of his sons to him, and he addresses each of them in turn. The substance of what he tells them, we will get back to later on, but he has words for each of them. And he dies, and with the permission of Pharaoh, Joseph and Joseph's entourage and the brothers and their families and servants and whatever all schlep to Hebron, to Kibbutz Machpelah, and they bury Jacob. And they come back right after Jacob dies. The brothers are concerned that Joseph will now feel free to take vengeance against them for the wrongs that they committed earlier in his life. So they make up a story that Jacob, just before he died, said, "Oh, and by the way, tell Joseph, not to take revenge on you, to forgive you." And Joseph says that he has no intention of doing that, that he will take care of them. And the Parsha concludes with Joseph dying and making his brothers promise that when the time comes, that they too will bury him in the promised land. So my first question is, why is it so important to Jacob and to Joseph where they are buried? Does it matter where you are buried? Is there some important message or magical property associated with being buried in a particular place? Any thoughts? I think in the case of Jacob, part of the impetus to request from Joseph that he be buried back in Hebron is that Jacob is feeling guilty about the fact that he did not bury Rachel in the cave of Machpelah, that she was she died while they were en route to somewhere else. At the time they were in Efrat, and he buried her there on the side of the road, which he makes reference to when he's talking to Joseph about this. So clearly
David.
this is...
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was thinking it's the same reason why people today sometimes choose to have burial in Israel. I think that there is a certain relationship with the land, even though, you know, the body is gone, that there is a relationship with the land, that we return to the earth. We're not, you know, traditionally we're not burned up or set fire in a raft and sea. We're put back into the land. And I think that these ancestors felt it important to be in the land that had been promised to them, that it was part of that covenant. Too obvious? I mean, I wanted to...
I think you're right. But I'm also thinking about how tenuous their relationship to that land is at this point.
Well,
Yeah,
they're both in Galut. You know, this isn't their land, and you know, Joseph's the only Jew in Egypt practically, and wanted to go home.
we could
Take his dad with him.
Sorry, Marty.
Sorry.
We could talk in today's terms about things that people hang on to generations afterwards as symbols in their homes or their world that have to do with those connections. And this isn't any land. I mean, there's a real covenant here. There's a promise made to Abraham. So I think the land is something beyond just the place where the ancestors came from.
So,
In terms of these, in terms specifically of Jacob and Joseph, especially Joseph, because he established this other whole life with wife and children, etc. But he was always other. He was always other in Egypt. And I think it's just in thinking about his last days, there was no question for him where he wanted his bones to rest.
right, although he doesn't know when his bones will actually be transferred there.
Right.
But he knows that there is a promise that at some point will be kept.
Well, you know, that need to be buried where you think your final resting place should be is so powerful. I just finished this long book on the fighting in the Pacific during World War II. And as you know, the fighting there was just probably the most horrific in all of World War II. On these godforsaken islands, so many people dying these horrible deaths, and of course, they needed to just bury them, even if not individually, but in the soldiers, the American soldiers, they had to bury them in the ground there on these islands. And sometimes even in bigger pits, because it was just so hard to deal with all of the deaths occurring in such a small place. But even then, when the war was over, they dug up all the bodies, all the soldiers who had died there, and offered their families the opportunity to bring them back to America. And you think how powerful that story is, and that need to come home. It's really an overwhelming emotion, and I think that's at play here.
If Israel were to become the land of the Jewish people, then having the bodies of Jacob and Joseph there, and particularly Jacob is one of the three patriarchs, that people would be able to come and to honor him throughout the years. If he were buried anyplace else, the journey would be long and the opportunity to honor him wouldn't be there.
That's true.
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Joel said, because it sort of, it gives the sense of not just we are part of the land, that we go back to the dust, but thinking ahead of who is going to come and visit us. So the way, David, you said before that, referencing Sing Along with Mitch sort of dates us. The people on the screen, I imagine, as we think about things like burial and burial plots, that we think about where will we be and who will visit us. And I think it's really an important thing that's on people's, minds in terms of the future and how we see ourselves. One unrelated note that is something I just learned recently. I have a friend whose children are Baha'i, and Baha'i, who many people know are headquartered in Israel, their custom is to bury within 100 miles of where you are when you die. So another very different custom than ours. But I think for Jews, it's natural to try to think ahead, even though we move around a good bit, of where our children and the others might come to visit us.
Certainly in the modern state of Israel, they have recognized the importance of burial in the state, hence the reburial of Herzl on Mount Herzl, and to appreciate the symbolic value of burial in Israel. Consider the fact that David Ben-Gurion prohibited the reburial of Jabotinsky in Israel as long as he was prime minister. And it was only when Levi Eshkol became prime minister that they were able to transfer his remains and bury him on Mount Herzl. So there is a lot of symbolic value.
Is this also a message that, because at this time, as we talked about in the last session, the Israelites had it pretty good in Egypt. They were in the wealthiest portion of the land. They had their relative as being the big macha in the land. And isn't this a message that, in some respects, Egypt is not your home? Any place where you may happen to be doing well is not your home. Your real home is in Israel. And isn't this a message toward that end?
Yeah, especially since the whole mishpacha is going back to the land that they were promised to bury him. They will actually have to be in the land and bury him in the land together. This is kind of a formative experience for the sons and for their sons who are presumably with them. I mean, 17 years have passed. And so they will carry the memory of having buried Jacob together in that land. Unless there's more to be said on this subject, we can move on to, let's see, can we move to page 297? Scroll down a little more. So Jacob is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh. And after having done so, well, Joseph points out that he has switched hands, and therefore he has given Ephraim the major blessing. And Jacob explains that he did that deliberately because Ephraim will be an even greater presence in the future than Manasseh will be, although Manasseh is going to do okay too. And then he says something interesting, and very famously, he says, "Ve'evarchem b'yom hahu lomar b'cha yevarech Yisrael lemor." Let's see, I guess we need the next page.
Yeah.
Lemor. Yasimech Elohim ke'Ephraim v'ke'Menashe. So he's saying not only are they going to be blessed, but when you look up the word blessed in the dictionary, you're going to see Ephraim and Menashe's picture. That this is going to be the quintessential blessing. But he says it in an interesting way. He says, Lemor Bach Yevarech Yisrael. He is referring to himself in the third person in the future. So we know that Yaakov has two names, Yaakov and Israel. Particularly in this parsha, the name Yaakov is associated with Yaakov as a man, a father, a husband, a mortal person, and the name Yisrael is used frequently in this parsha in the context of Yisrael being the founder of a people, of being a patriarch. And it struck me that in saying it in this way, he is already casting himself into the future. He's saying, when he's saying Yisrael, he's referring to Bnei Israel, Am Yisrael. He's already seeing himself as being the progenitor of this people, and so his actions here are all taking place in that context. Given that, why is it that there is this consistent pattern of preferring a younger sibling to the older sibling? I mean, we've seen it time and again in Breshit. What is the message of the case of Yitzchak, in the case of Yaakov, and now as we shall see shortly, Reuven is going to kind of get the short end, and Yosef has been given the double portion that is usually reserved to the oldest child. Why is that? What is going on here? What is the message here? Is this
Well, the obvious is merit over tradition. Potential merit, I mean, because it happens often younger in the lives, or another traditional interpretation would be chosenness, destiny, but I've always thought it has to do with not by rote going with the tradition of the times, which is to give everything to the elder no matter.
So this is God saying, when I speak my mind, when I impose my will, you are going to follow it even if it is against tradition. So it's deliberately breaking the rules to show that God's law will override. It's worth noting that in Dvarim, this subject gets revisited in a passage where Moses, in God's name, says, Oh, by the way, if you prefer your second son to your first son, you still have to treat your first son as a first son and give him all of his rights and his double portion. No, show no favoritism.
Hmm.
So, so this was, and that has been the tradition since, to the extent that we follow these traditions. But it seems as though there was this break in tradition because it was God's word to do it, but at some point it became too disruptive. A too great a precedent had been set. It seems like in later generations, patriarchs of families took it upon themselves to make these decisions based on these earlier precedents, and they decided they had to put a stop to it. It is a pretty, subversive idea, but it's also pretty clear that this happens only in the context of God, saying that it was acceptable. At least in the case of Yitzchak and in the case of Yaakov. In the case of Yosef, you could read the history of Yosef as creating a presumption that he would be preferred, but we don't hear God saying it. There's no pronouncement from God saying, Yosef will be the one.
David, I think Annette wants to share.
Please, unmute yourself.
Actually, it was going back to way at the very beginning when you were talking about choosing a grave site. Very simplistically, when we here buy a cemetery plot, that's where we plan that we should be buried and our family should go there. So very simplistically, maybe that's where he was going back. But
Well, I recall Wes once saying, do we all need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that 100, 200 years from now, wherever it is that we're buried, no one will know who we are, and no one will come to visit. That's it's a sobering thought. But I guess if you're the patriarch of a people, it matters more where you're buried than if you're just plain folks like us.
Well, but David, then you have to talk about the fact that it's explicit that no one knows where Moses is buried.
Right. So that that doesn't become a form of idolatry. When you consider the amount of rancor that's associated with the cave of Machpelah today,
Yeah.
the situation in Hebron today, it makes one wonder if our attachment to certain locations in the land of Israel, even today, can border on idolatry. But now I'm getting
Lubavitcher Rebbe's tomb.
I'm sorry.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe's tomb in Queens is practically a religious site.
But these issues of who gets what they're still with us. It's not infrequent where you have more than one child, and among the children, they have different resources, different assets, and when one dies, do you distribute your assets equally to each child, notwithstanding their differences of situation? Or do you distribute them according to their situation? And so that this issue of in its bluntest terms, who gets what, are still in that respect very much with us. And the answer to those questions are not easy questions. Because of, is it going to be seen as favoring? Will the children understand that it's being done because of a recognition of different resources? If children make different choices in their lives, shouldn't they have to live with them? These are still confounding issues that we still face today.
And
They are, Michael, confounding to people like myself who are estate planners. In terms of how do you counsel clients who come in with a situation you describe. And for many people, they favor equality regardless of the situation because they just think it's the fairest thing to do. But it becomes more and more of an issue these days where people are asking their estate planners, what should I do? It's an age-old question.
And what do you tell them?
Depends on the circumstances, I think, in part. But for the most part, they have to consider how are the children going to relate to one another if one is treated, in a sense, greater than the other. Let's say there are three than the other two. And that's one of the things. If you can discuss this with the children before death, so that they can understand why there may be some inequality. Sometimes I advise clients to do that before they make that decision.
But it's not just at death. I mean, if you have more than one child, there are different ways of treating each child according to their capabilities and etc. So it just continues from life, but it's not an easy decision.
now, so you're all talking about treating children differently based on their needs and what's fair. What I don't hear you doing is making judgments about their intrinsic worth, which is my segue into Jacob's last words to his sons, where he does some very interesting things. He treats them inconsistently, and I've puzzled over what method there was to his madness. If we turn to page 299. Here's where he goes roughly in order of seniority, making a few changes. But he starts with Reuven, the oldest, and he says, Reuven, you are my firstborn, my might and first fruit of my vigor, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor. And then a sudden change in tone. Unstable as water, you shall excel no longer. For when you mounted your father's bed, you brought disgrace. And as though making an aside to the other brothers, he says, my couch he mounted. So once again, we have the firstborn brought kind of low. And the basis for that is, for those of you who may not recall, Reuven did lie with Bilhah, one of Jacob's concubines, and the mother of two of his stepbrothers. And Jacob cannot let this go, while still acknowledging that Reuven might have had some some positive qualities. I'm going to offer an opinion that Reuven is really getting the shaft here. There are very detailed commentaries about what happened between Reuven and Bilhah that are attempts to exculpate Reuven and say, well, he didn't actually lie with her. You know, rabbis have these ways of, you know, adjusting the facts. Leaving that aside, let's assume that he's guilty. Let's also recall that Reuven was, when the brothers were conspiring to kill Joseph, Reuven is the one who said, no, we're not going to spill his blood. Let's just throw him into the pit. And the text says that he made that suggestion with the intention of going back later, getting Joseph and returning him to Jacob. A plan that was thwarted by subsequent events. Now, Yehuda gets credit for being the hero on that occasion by saying, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. But it seems to me that Reuven was striving for an even higher and loftier goal. Of course, Jacob is not aware of these details. Also, when Pharaoh was demanding that Benjamin be left behind, it was Reuven who first and foremost, he said he took responsibility to Jacob for making sure that Benjamin would be safe. And he was the first to volunteer to stay. But then Judah steps in, and Judah ends up being the one that stays. So Judah is like, he's stealing the show on both occasions. And I think all of this may be retrospective in light of the fact that in later years, Judah became the most prominent tribe and Reuven kind of faded away. So it's a way of explaining it. But as a matter of, I just think it's unjust. But now that I've gotten that off my chest, we can move on. Unless people have any thoughts. So
I was thinking, you know, what's sometimes interesting is when people get older, as it's happening to all of us, maybe to me, and in your old age, all of your actions are not exactly righteous sometimes. And in this case, I wonder about whether this old man is settling scores, whether his attempt to impose his favorites is once again the sign of an old man. Just throwing that out.
well, but was he an old man when he favored Joseph? I guess he was already not a spring chicken at that point.
Wait, it really strikes me that before he makes these long explanations of what he's chosen for all the other brothers, he just says, Jacob says to Joseph, and now I assign you one portion more than to your brothers, without any further explanation. It's the same old story, and there's no justification given.
There's there's no justification. There is a gloss on his doing that, and that is that he is trying to compensate for the fact that Rachel died young and did not have an opportunity to give him more children. So he is trying to make up for that by giving each of Joseph's sons, a separate portion. It's not an excuse, and it's not a justification.
But when they're all assembled, it's one more reminder that he was always treated differently by Jacob.
Yes, and there's more to come with the other brothers.
Right.
So next he Also, this is called, traditionally called the blessing of Jacob, this gathering of the brothers and discussion of each one. We can, once we've gone through them quickly, we can talk about whether or not this is in fact a blessing, and if it is a blessing, of what sort. So in the case of Shimon and Levi, he says, their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their counsel. When angry, they slay men. All of this clearly is a reference to what happened after their sister Dinah was raped, and how they slaughtered the Canaanites in large numbers to avenge what happened to her. At the time, Jacob was furious with them for having done it, for having put him and the entire family in danger by having done so. Once again, he cannot let it go.
Yeah, he's settling scores.
It's interesting to see Levi in particular in this light, considering the lofty status that Levi has later in the story. Then he gets to Judah, and you can continue the next page. We get Judah as the lion cub, the leader, the ruler's staff from between his feet. So tribute shall come to him. He's being anointed as the leader of his people. Once again, we can look at this retrospectively, but looking at it clearly as of the moment that his sons are in front of him, as he did with Joseph, he is showing favoritism to Judah. The reasons why he might prefer Judah are not really known to him, the stories that we know of Judah. So it's not clear on what basis this is. Is this prophecy, or is it just his expressing his own, his own emotions?
David, are we supposed to believe that God endorses this distribution, as it were?
It doesn't say that he's speaking God's words. It does. It does lead you to wonder what it is that Jacob is doing here. As Steve says, he seems to be settling old scores, but he also knows that they are all going to constitute a people that will be a multitude and be a great nation. What is he doing here that fosters that and has him acting like the founder of a people, and what has him acting like a grumpy old man?
Well, David, you could say that he's trying to be a retiring leader and trying to put the official characterization on those of his sons that he feels are less moral and less capable than others. I've always thought that Judah got the leg up because of his management of the Tamar incident. He really shows moral fortitude out of that. And maybe he's just pointing out to all of them that he's seen the worst, and that moving forward into this, they are now in a different land. They have some future ahead of them. That I'm giving Jacob a break, but he may just be as a leader trying to put the official characterization on the son, so that the ones who are troublemakers have less power. Just saying.
Right, but
Yeah,
Steve,
David, yeah, following up on that, Maida, what really sort of blows me away here is Levi. So Levi is excoriated here with his brother Simeon for their warlike practices. And there's only one note you see in the Chumash notes here below. I mean, how does Levi and this tribe or this culture that he's in go on to become the Levian we think about as sort of choir boys, and has a status that's certainly elevated? They're part of the clergy. They get special, and we keep this to the day, of special status in getting aliyahs. We don't always do it at temple, right? But Kohen, Levi. And to me, it's so interesting because it goes against the axiom of behavior predicts behavior, that there's some type of, yeah.
Steve, they don't get weapons
They don't get weapons when?
in future wars.
So maybe that's the way you change people, but you certainly wouldn't predict, if you're saying these are predictions of Jacob, you wouldn't think that those sort of among the most warlike tribe, and one that is seen so negatively, gets elevated to the status of people who serve in the temple. We have the legends about the beautiful music that the Levites, contributed and has been lost. It's just it's something in there that I don't think we look at enough.
well, one could analogize to the story of Pinchas, who, in a fit of rage, skewered the sinning Israelite.
Imri and Cosby.
Yes, thank you. And God praises him, but then makes him Kohen Gadol. He puts him in a situation where his activities will be fairly regulated.
Yeah. But even there, David, you could say it's because of religious zealotry. Here at Levi, this isn't the kind of violence that's pointed to, is not necessarily in the service of God.
Well, that's true. It's just it's a personal vendetta or a family vendetta.
In a recent Talmud class, talking about leadership, for those of you who saw it, you may recall that the line that the West talked about, I think it was from Larry Backow, that if you want to be loved, get a dog. Otherwise, a leader has to make tough choices. And I wonder if this can be seen in that light as the ultimate leadership burden, that even when the tough choices are being made with respect to your children, if you're going to be a leader, and as you said, David, founding a nation, then you need to make these very tough calls, because that's going to be in the best interest of the nation you're trying to found. And Jacob, if one wanted to be charitable, is just exercising the ultimate responsibility of leadership.
But going on to leadership, that you have Judah, right? We're called Yehudim, right? We're named after Judah. And he fathered the Davidic line.
Right, but again, that's if we're just trying to put ourselves in Jacob's place at the time, was he providing constructive criticism? was he giving them a performance review?
Nobody's
No,
setting the course of the nation going forward.
Yeah.
And as tough as it was, he's a leader and he's a founder, and that's what you got to do.
Yeah, he's the patriarch and he's going to make the decisions. There's no concept of consensus or democracy or anything like that. Every once in a while, there are portions in the Torah where I think it is, we come to areas where I think the Torah was written by men to send, to send certain kinds of messages, to explain certain kinds of things that have happened. And it occurs to me that this section, especially when you're explaining why Yehuda and not Ruvain, why how the Levites will ascend to their position, while at the same time they're not such good people in the past. It's almost as if the authors are trying to tell us this is the way it's going to happen. This is the way it is. Even with the sort of notions of going back to the land, it's going to create a tradition for us that we visit graves twice a year. And in particular, we visit graves on Pesach because they were strangers in a strange land. So here, in a sense, I'm thinking almost like here's the author telling us how he divvied up those things, and it's almost writing about it to explain what is.
Yes. So
Not a very God-believing sort of explanation, though. But many of us in class have a tough time with God anyway.
Harvey?
yes. So Steve, I agree with that. This wasn't written contemporaneously with the events. This was written when the fate of the tribes was well known, and so you could just view this not as a literary document, but in its place in history. This was a retroactive justification of how things ended up the way they are at the time it was written.
Yeah.
But I still don't think that's the best way to read them. I mean, that's the way the biblical critics will read it, but I don't think that's the best way to read the Bible. I think we should still read it as literature, as it's presented to us, and try to evaluate it. And then it's the question is, the questions that David's asking, I think they're very profound questions. How do you interpret this way of relating to your children? It's a hard question. I think you could read it as a prediction, saying, here's what's coming, get ready for it. This is, be prepared,
Yep.
As opposed to here is what I wish for you because of what you deserve. But I think it's a very this has always been a problematic text for me. And I've always had the exact same question that David asked, is why do they call this Jacob's blessings? Because most of it reads like anything but blessings.
Well, it's a blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yes, but overall, but the text as a whole doesn't have a feeling of goodwill to it.
Yeah, but Harvey, I think you bring up a very important question. James Kugel's book, How to Read the Bible, goes into these issues. I think we all struggle with exactly the dilemmas that you put forward. Is it literature or is this explanatory? And this poem sort of hits me that way.
Yeah, I might point out that, this tradition of parents choosing one child over another has gone on for generations, well beyond what's here. If you think about our own community, we have had significant splits, open splits, in a number of prominent Jewish families in this community, including one recently where a sale was made of legal seafood. And if you remember, we had that issue a number of years ago of a choice that George had to make among his two boys. We've had it in the Saunders family. We've had a lot of families in this community. This thing continues to go on.
We should wrap it up.
Maybe in those situations where Jacob is lashing out, maybe it's an indication that some flaws, some types of behavior are beyond the pale, that they can't be forgiven. Reuven sleeping with Bilhah is maybe that's the kind of sin that attaches to you and never leaves you. The same with the wanton violence of Levi and Shimon, although in the case of Levi, they did find a way to redeem themselves. Okay, well, how much time do I have? A minute? If on page 302,
Oops.
oh, sorry, I'll just read it aloud. You don't have to go there.
All right.
The only other son that comes in for some criticism, albeit indirect, is Issachar, where Jacob says, Issachar is a strong-boned ass crouching among the sheepfolds. When he saw how good was security and how pleasant was the country, he bent his shoulder to the burden and became a toiling serf. He was passive and took the easy way out. Again, calling your son as saying that your son is so passive and timid that he's going to turn himself into a serf. Once again, maybe that is an unforgivable sin in the context of creating a people. And I will check out what he says about the other sons at your leisure. It's interesting to look at.
Well, thank you, David.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
participating.
Koach, great
Eshkoach,
job.
David.
Join us next week where Steve Broder will be our darshan. And that will be the final week of our winter Zoomcation Shul. And join us again during the summer when Summer Shul comes up, and this will be our 10th year. So join us for that. Anyway, let's do, did Kaddish to Rabbanan come up on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
thank you, Marty, for organizing everything.
My
Yes.
pleasure.
Yes,
My
thank you,
pleasure.
Marty.
Marty.
My pleasure. Thank you. You're welcome.
Toda Rabban, yes.
All right, let's do it.
Marty.
Yid Gadal,
Yid
Yid
Kadash,
Kadash,
Shmeirama,
Yom
Yom
HaTorah,
HaTorah,
Yom
Yom
Lichutei,
HaChavtei,
Chayechon, Yom Echon, Chaye B'chol Beit Yisrael, Agalav Yizman V'Yivru, Amen.
Amen.
Yay.
Shmei Rabba Barak
Amen.
Yitbarach, Yishtabach,
Yitbarach,
Yitboar,
Yitboar,
Yadar, Yitoleh, Le'ela, Mikol, Shirata, Tushbata, Menata, Da'amiran, Yomar,
Amen.
Al Yisrael, Al Tamidei, Tamidei, V'yal Kol
V'Oraita,
Dibiata, Dei, V'Achar,
Behei Kol Shlama Rabba, Bechina Bechista V'Rachamim,
Chayin
Arifim, Zman Avicha, Kana Min Kadam Avuhun, Dibishma
Amen.
Amen.
Yehi Shlama Rabba Mishmaya, Chaim Tovim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Amen.
Amen.
Oseh Shalom
Shalom
B'Romav,
Hu
U'Barachamav Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Amen.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you, David.
Okay. And